She cooked for 23 people and wasn't allowed a chair at the table. Martha Calloway spent 14 hours on her feet, kneading dough before sunrise, tending fire, stirring pots until her fingers went numb. And when the feast was finally laid out and the family gathered with loud voices and louder appetites, her aunt looked her dead in the eyes and told her to take her plate outside, in the cold, alone. And every single person at that table watched it happen without saying a word. This is her story. Stay with me until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. The trouble with Wyoming in October was that the cold didn't come gradually. It didn't creep in through the window cracks or settle politely into the valley like fog. It arrived the way certain people arrived, all at once, without warning, taking up every inch of space and making it impossible to remember what warmth had ever felt like. Martha Calloway had lived on the Calloway Ranch her entire 34 years, and she knew this cold the way she knew the sound of the floorboards in the kitchen, the way the second shelf on the left side of the pantry tilted slightly downward, the way the cast iron skillet needed to be seasoned every third use or it would start to stick. She knew everything about this house, every corner, every draft, every imperfection. What she didn't know, what no one had thought to tell her, was that the house had belonged to her for 15 years, but that was a secret for later. She woke at 4:17 that Thursday morning, not because an alarm told her to, because her body had been trained over decades to start working before anyone else opened their eyes. The kitchen was dark and cold when she came downstairs in her heavy wool stockings and her grandmother's faded blue apron, the one with the pocket on the left side that she'd mended 3 times. She lit the stove without thinking, put the first pot on before the water had even fully heated. She moved through the kitchen the way a musician moves through a familiar piece of music, not thinking about the notes, just playing. By 5 o'clock, she had 2 loaves of bread rising under a cloth and a pot of stock already simmering. By 6, she had started the apple pies. 4 of them. Edith had specified 4, which was 1 more than last year because Edith's son Harold was bringing a woman none of them had met, and Edith wanted the table to look generous. Martha didn't think about that much. She just rolled the dough. The thing about cooking for 23 people was that it wasn't really cooking, it was management. You had to think backwards from the meal, calculating time like a person planning a military campaign. The venison needed 4 hours at low heat. The biscuits couldn't go in until 40 minutes before serving or they'd dry out. The gravy was always last because gravy waited for no one and no one should wait for gravy. She kept a handwritten list tucked into the pocket of her apron, items crossed off as she went, though by this point she barely needed it. The list was more for comfort than necessity. Her cousin Ruth came downstairs around 8, poured herself coffee from the pot Martha had already made, and said, without looking up, "Is the ham started?" "Since 6, Martha said. "Edith wants it crispier this year. Last year it was too soft." Martha didn't respond. She turned back to the stove. Ruth left with her coffee. The family began arriving by noon. They came in through the front door, which Martha had never once used, always the side entrance near the kitchen, stamping mud off their boots and unwrapping scarves and filling the house with noise. There were cousins she saw twice a year and uncles she couldn't fully keep straight, and a collection of children who ran through the hallways and occasionally appeared in the kitchen doorway to stare at her before being called back by their mothers. Nobody came into the kitchen to help. This wasn't unusual. This was simply how it was. Martha's back had started aching around 10 o'clock, the familiar low pull across her hips that came from standing too long on the stone floor. She shifted her weight from foot to foot when she remembered to, but mostly she forgot to remember because there was always something on the stove that needed attention. "Martha." Her Aunt Edith appeared in the kitchen doorway at noon. She was a tall woman, angular in the way of someone who had decided years ago that softness was a form of weakness. Her hair was always pinned, always precise. She looked at the kitchen the way a general surveys a battlefield, looking for what was wrong. "The biscuits," Edith said. "You haven't started them." "I start them at 4:15, Martha said, 40 minutes before we eat." "We're eating at 5. "I know." Edith's eyes moved across the counter, cataloging. The pies cooling on the rack, the bread already sliced, the stock reduced and waiting. Her expression didn't change, but she gave a small nod that was the closest thing to approval she ever offered. "Harold's woman is vegetarian," Edith said. Did I tell you that? She had not. I'll put together something, Martha said. Something good, Edith said. I don't want it to look like we weren't prepared. And then she was gone, back to her guests, back to the conversation and the laughter, and the warm light of the sitting room where everyone had gathered. Martha stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Then she started figuring out what she had that she could turn into a vegetarian dish in 4 hours. She had squash. She had sage. She had cream. It would be fine. By 3 in the afternoon, the kitchen smelled like everything a home was supposed to smell like. Apple and cinnamon and roasting meat and wood smoke and bread. It was the kind of smell that made strangers feel nostalgic for things they'd never had. Martha was sweating through her dress. Her feet had gone past aching into a kind of numbness that she had learned to interpret as a sign she needed to sit down, which she could not do, so she ignored it. Her younger cousin Dottie wandered into the kitchen around 3:30. Dottie was 20, newly married, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been told they were wrong about anything important. It smells amazing in here, Dottie said, lifting the cloth on the biscuit dough to peek. You're so talented, Martha, you really are. Don't lift that, Martha said, not unkindly. Dottie let the cloth fall. Sorry. She leaned against the counter. You know, you should teach a class or something. Charge money for it. I'm serious. People would pay good money to learn to cook like this. Martha looked at her cousin. Dottie meant it kindly. She could tell. But there was something uncomfortable about being admired for your usefulness while still being treated like furniture. Maybe someday, Martha said. Dottie grabbed a slice of bread from the rack, not asking, and wandered back out. Martha put another log on the fire. At 4:55, she began to carry dishes to the table. It took 7 trips because she was doing it alone, and the dining room was at the far end of a long hallway. On the 3rd trip, she passed her Uncle Gerald, and he said, "Need a hand?" And she said, "I'm all right," because she knew he wouldn't actually follow through, and it was easier not to test it. The table looked beautiful. She knew how to set a table, knew how the light from the window caught the steam rising from the bowls of food, knew where to place the bread so it was within easy reach of everyone but didn't crowd the centerpiece. 23 chairs. She had counted them herself that morning when she'd pulled the table out to its full extension. She was not in any of the chairs. She knew this because she had not set a place for herself. She had learned a long time ago that setting a place for herself only created a problem when Edith needed the seat for someone else and had to ask Martha to move. It was easier to simply not. The family filed in at 5 o'clock exactly because Edith ran the household on a precise schedule, and they arranged themselves around the table with the easy confidence of people who had never once had to wonder whether there was room for them. There was talking and the scraping of chairs and the serving of food and a lot of reaching across the table without asking. Martha stood at the edge of the room for a moment, watching. She was waiting to see if anyone would say something. She was not sure what she was hoping for. She told herself she wasn't hoping for anything. Edith looked up from the head of the table and found her standing there. "Martha," she said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. The pleasantness was the most cutting thing about it. "It's cold tonight. You'd better take your plate before everything gets cold." Martha waited. "Outside would be fine," Edith said. "There's a crate by the barn you can use." The room did not go silent. That was the part Martha would remember most. It didn't go silent because no one thought it was strange enough to stop for. Conversations continued. Someone asked someone to pass the bread. Harold introduced his vegetarian girlfriend to Edith's sister, and the girlfriend smiled politely and said everything looked wonderful. Martha went to the kitchen. She put food on a plate. She went outside. The crate was still there, where it had been every year, beside the barn wall on the south side, partially sheltered from the worst of the wind by the corner of the building. She sat down. The cold came up through the wood immediately and settled into her thighs and hips, adding itself to the ache already living there. The plate was warm. That much she had. She'd made sure to take it directly from the stove. Inside, through the thin wooden wall, she could hear muffled laughter. Someone was telling a story. She couldn't make out the words. She looked down at the food on her plate. Venison she had slow-cooked since morning. Biscuits she had timed precisely to come out right. Gravy she had made from the drippings. She took one bite. It was good. was exactly as good as she'd wanted it to be. She was not sure what she felt. She was tired enough that feelings were difficult to locate. There was a blankness that she had come to mistake for peace, though she knew in some back corner of her mind that it wasn't peace. It was the absence of something she'd stopped letting herself name. The wind picked up off the flat land to the north and cut straight through her wool dress. She tucked her chin down and kept eating. She heard the horse before she saw him. One horse. Slow walk, coming up the main path from the eastern road. She didn't look up at first. Travelers passed through, especially in autumn, headed south before winter fully arrived. But the hoofbeats slowed and stopped, and after a moment she heard the sound of someone dismounting, and then the creak of the hitching post. She looked up. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had clearly been through several hard winters without complaint. His hat was plain, dark, well-worn. He had a week's worth of beard and the kind of unhurried way of moving that came from spending most of your time in open country. He looked at the house. Then he looked at her. His eyes took in the scene. Woman alone, outside, plate in hand, barn at her back, warm light from the house windows, sound of laughter coming from inside. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there for a moment, and his expression shifted into something she couldn't fully read. Not pity, exactly. Something more like a quiet kind of anger that he was keeping mostly under control. "Evening," he finally said. "Evening," she said. "Silas Rowan." He didn't tip his hat, just nodded once. "I bought the Hendricks parcel, north of town. I was told the Calloway family might be willing to sell some winter hay. That would be something to speak to Edith about," Martha said. "She's inside." He looked at the house again, then back at her, then at the plate in her hands. "You eat yet?" he asked. She looked down at her plate. "I'm eating now." He nodded slowly. "The food any good?" Despite everything, a very small, tired, almost involuntary thing happened at the corner of her mouth. "It's the best thing I've made in 3 years," she said. "That's so." He looked back at the house. "Seems like a fine place to eat it, then." He paused. "Inside." "They're a bit full," she said carefully. He looked at her for a long moment. Full of people or full of themselves? She didn't answer that. He walked back to his horse, reached into the saddlebag, and pulled out a cloth bundle that turned out to contain a tin plate and a fork wrapped in a bandana, the kind of thing a man carried who was used to eating wherever he happened to be. Then he walked back to where she was sitting and looked at the barn wall. "Room on that crate?" he asked. "It's not comfortable," she said. She was warning him. She didn't know why. Most honest things aren't. He sat down on the end of the crate, not too close, leaving her space. He looked at her plate. "Mind if I take a biscuit? I'll pay for it." "You don't need to pay," she said, confused. "What's your name?" "Martha. Martha Calloway." "Martha." He said it once like he was filing it somewhere. "Is any of that venison still warm?" She looked at him. He was watching the empty dark field in front of them with perfectly easy expression, like sitting on a wooden crate in the cold outside a stranger's barn was a completely acceptable way to spend a Thursday evening. "Why aren't you going inside?" she asked. He was quiet for a second. "Don't feel like it," he said. It was not a complicated answer. It was, in fact, an absurdly simple answer. But something about it, the flatness of it, the complete absence of drama, made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She stood up without quite deciding to. She took his tin plate and went inside the kitchen, not the dining room, the kitchen, and filled it from the pot still on the stove. Venison, 2 biscuits, gravy, a piece of pie. She carried it back outside. She sat back down on the crate. He accepted the plate. He looked at the food. He picked up his fork. "Thank you," he said. They ate together in the cold, with the sound of laughter coming through the wall beside them, and the Wyoming dark stretching out endlessly in every direction, and the stars beginning to appear above the flat horizon, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was the first time in a long time that Martha didn't feel entirely alone. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she just kept eating. Her biscuits really were perfect that year. She'd finally figured out the ratio of butter to cold lard that made them hold together without going hard. Little things like that mattered. She'd spent years getting them right. She thought maybe someone should have told her that earlier, but she supposed now was as good a time as any to know. Silas Rowan was not a complicated man, but he was a careful one. He had learned early in life that the most telling thing about a person wasn't what they said, but what they allowed, what they sat across from without flinching, what they participated in without question, simply because everyone around them was doing the same. He had walked away from enough situations in his 41 years to know that silence in the face of something wrong wasn't neutrality. It was a vote. So when he finished the last of his venison and set the tin plate on his knee and looked at Martha Calloway sitting beside him on that wooden crate, with the wind pulling at the loose strands of her hair and the cold coming up through the boards beneath them both, he made a quiet decision. He didn't announce it. He just made it. He was going to stay exactly where he was. Martha had stopped talking after that first exchange, retreating back into whatever place she went when she didn't want to be reached. He didn't push. He'd met enough people to know that some of them needed silence the way others needed conversation. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they'd learned the hard way that saying things out loud often cost more than staying quiet. He respected that. He just didn't intend to leave her alone with it. The laughter inside the house rose and fell in waves. Someone was telling a story that kept getting interrupted by other voices, and the interruptions were louder than the story itself, which meant it was probably one of the men trying to be funny and nobody quite letting him land the joke. Silas had been to enough family gatherings, other people's mostly, since his own family had thinned considerably over the years, to recognize the particular sound of a room full of people who were comfortable, who had always been comfortable, who had never once had to wonder whether they were included. He looked sideways at Martha without turning his head fully. She was eating carefully, small bites, the posture of a woman who had learned to take up as little space as possible, even in the physical act of eating. Her shoulders were pulled in slightly, not from cold. She'd straightened when he first arrived, some animal instinct toward dignity, but from something older, something that had been practiced so long it had become posture. His jaw tightened. He looked back at the dark field. "You do this every year?" he asked. He kept his voice neutral, no edge to it. He wasn't asking to make a point. He genuinely wanted to know how long this had been going on. Martha didn't answer immediately. She chewed, swallowed, set her fork across her plate the way you did when you were deciding something. "Most years," she said. "Most. Some years there's not enough room inside. Some years Edith has a reason." She paused. "This year she said the cold air would be good for me." Silas absorbed this. "The cold air," he repeated. "That's what she said." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when someone told him something that didn't make sense, and he was deciding whether to say so. He decided not to. Not yet. "How long did you cook today?" he asked. She looked at him then, briefly, a sideways glance that was partly suspicious and partly something else. The look of someone unaccustomed to being asked questions that implied their time had value. "I started around 4:15 this morning," she said. "In the morning." "Yes." He said nothing, just let that sit between them like a stone dropped in still water. Martha looked back at her plate. "It's not as much as it sounds," she said. "There's a rhythm to it. You stop noticing the time." "I notice you're still outside," he said, quietly. No judgment in it, just the fact of it. Her fork went still. That was the moment, not dramatic, not announced, when something shifted between them. He hadn't said it to wound her. He'd said it because it was true, and because he thought she deserved someone to say it plainly, without dressing it up or making it softer than it was. She had cooked since before sunrise. She was eating outside alone in 35-degree wind. And 23 people were inside a house that smelled like everything she had made, laughing at jokes he couldn't hear. "I should go in," she said, though she didn't move. "Check on the pies. There might be—" "The pies are done," he said. "You brought them out before you came here. I saw them on the table." She stopped, looked at him. "You looked through the window?" "The door was open when someone came in. I saw the table." He met her eyes evenly. "You set a good table, Martha." She looked away again, and he could see her jaw working slightly, the way people's jaws worked when they were managing something they didn't want visible. The kitchen door opened. They both looked. It was Edith. She stood in the door frame with the warm light behind her, turning her into a silhouette, and her eyes found Silas immediately with the particular focus of a woman who had just been informed of something unexpected. Someone inside must have looked out and seen him. Edith was not the kind of woman who liked surprises. and she especially did not like surprises that happened on her property without her permission. Mr. Rowan. Her voice was warm, deliberately so, the warmth of someone turning on a faucet. We didn't realize you were out here. Please, come inside. She stepped back from the door in invitation. We have more than enough room. I appreciate that, Silas said pleasantly. He didn't move. I'm all right here. There was a beat of silence. Edith's eyes moved to Martha, then back to Silas. Her expression recalibrated the way a machine recalibrated, almost imperceptibly, but you could catch it if you were watching for it. It's cold out, she said. You'll freeze. I've been colder, he said. He picked up his fork. This venison is remarkable, by the way. Did you make it? Edith's chin lifted slightly. Martha handles the cooking. I figured, he said. He looked at Martha. What did you do to it? The venison? What's the technique? Martha blinked. It was possible no one had ever asked her that at a family gathering. It was possible no one had ever asked her that at all. Low heat, she said after a moment. A long time. You have to be patient with it or it gets tight. Patience, he said, nodding. That's the whole thing, isn't it? Mr. Rowan. Edith's voice had cooled by approximately 5 degrees. My husband would very much like to speak with you about the Hendricks land. He's inside. We have a fire going. It seems a waste to conduct business in the cold when— I'm not conducting business tonight, Silas said pleasantly. I'll come by Monday if that's all right. Another pause. Longer this time. Of course, Edith said. Her voice had settled into something careful and flat, the tone of a woman who was used to being obeyed and was quietly recalculating. Well, Martha, she looked at her niece. When you're finished, there are dishes. She went back inside. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound that had been building in Martha's chest, something compressed and tightly wound, released itself in a long, slow exhale that she tried to make quiet and didn't quite manage. She always like that? Silas asked. Martha took a second. She means well, she said. It was automatic. The kind of thing you said so many times it stopped being a sentence and became a reflex. Silas didn't argue with it. He just looked at her steadily until she heard herself. Martha stopped, started again. She runs things. She always has, since my grandmother passed. How long ago was that? 15 years. He nodded. And the cooking, that's always been you. My mother used to help, before she got sick. A pause. She passed 8 years ago. I'm sorry, he said. He said it simply, without elaborating, which was the right way to say it. Thank you, she said. She looked at the dark field. It's just what it is. You get used to the shape of things. Do you? He asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it, which was unusual because normally she would have said yes automatically, the same way she'd said Edith meant well. But there was something about the directness of his questions, no performance to them, no agenda she could detect, that made automatic answers feel dishonest. Not really, she said. You just get tired enough that the shape stops feeling sharp. He was quiet for a moment. That's a sad thing to have figured out, he said. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her with pity. That was the thing. Pity had a particular face, a softening around the eyes, a tilt of the head, the expression of someone glad the bad thing was happening to you and not to them. He didn't look like that. He looked like someone listening to something that bothered him on a level that was slow-burning and solid, the way anger looked when it belonged to a patient person. You're a strange man, Mr. Rowan, she said. Silas, he said. Silas? She tried it out. You rode up here to talk about hay. I did. And now you're eating dinner on a wooden crate in the cold. The venison was worth it, he said. She laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A short, surprise sound, slightly too loud, and she pressed her lips together after it like she was embarrassed by it. But it had happened. A real laugh. He heard it. He smiled, looking at the field. Not at her, giving her the privacy of the moment. Tell me about the rest of it, he said. The menu. What else is on that table? So she told him about the bread and the ratios she'd spent 3 years adjusting, about the biscuits and the cold lard trick she'd figured out last winter, about the 4 apple pies and the reason she'd added cardamom this year, which was an experiment she wasn't entirely sure had worked, about the squash dish she'd thrown together in 4 hours because nobody had told her about the vegetarian girlfriend until noon. He listened to all of it, asked actual questions, wanted to know why she'd chosen sage for the squash, what made cardamom work with apple, whether she'd tried a longer brine on the venison or if the slow cook was enough. They were the questions of someone who either cooked himself or was genuinely curious about the craft of it, and something in Martha loosened slowly as she talked. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough that the cold stopped feeling as cold. The door opened again. This time it wasn't Edith, it was Harold, Edith's son, a thick-necked man in his mid-30s who had the smile of someone who'd been told his whole life he was charming and had accepted this as fact. He carried a glass of something amber, and he leaned against the doorframe with the easy posture of a man who never had to wonder if he was welcome anywhere. "Silas Rowan," Harold said. "Heard you were out here. Come on in, man. We've got whiskey, and Pop wants to hear about the Hendricks parcel." "I'll be in a bit," Silas said. Harold's eyes moved to Martha with the same careless assessment he'd probably used his whole life, the glance that cataloged and dismissed simultaneously. "Martha," he said. Not unfriendly, just indifferent. The tone of someone speaking to furniture that had responded unexpectedly. "You doing all right out here?" "Fine," she said. "Good, good." He was already looking back at Silas. "Come on, seriously, it's cold as hell out here." "I know," Silas said. "Doesn't seem to have stopped Martha any." Harold blinked. The comment didn't fully register because it wasn't the kind of comment Harold's brain was set up to receive. His brain was set up for camaraderie and transaction, and what Silas had said didn't fit either category. He laughed a little, uncertainly. "Right. Well, whenever you're ready." He went back inside. Martha stared at the door after it closed. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Say that. About me." He shrugged. "It was true." "People say true things to make a point," she said. "I don't need anyone making points on my behalf." He looked at her then, and for a second she thought he was going to push back, but he just nodded. "Fair," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." She hadn't expected him to concede that easily. It put her slightly off balance, which she suspected might have been intentional, though he didn't look like a man who played games. They stayed outside for another 20 minutes. The stars were fully out by then, the way Wyoming stars came out. Not one or two at a time, but all at once, the whole sky going from dark to brilliantly, overwhelming, lit up without much warning. Martha had grown up under those stars, and still found herself occasionally startled by them. "I should go in," she said eventually. "The dishes." He stood when she stood, which she didn't expect. It wasn't performative, he just stood, the way someone stood when the person they were talking to got up. She gathered her plate and his tin plate, because that was habit, and he let her take his without making it into a thing. "Thank you," he said again. "For the food." He didn't oversay it. She nodded and went inside. The kitchen was warm, and the contrast with the cold outside hit her in the face like something physical. She set the plates in the basin and stood for a moment, hands on the edge of the counter, letting her eyes adjust to the light. From the dining room, she could hear the gathering shifting into its after-dinner shape. Lower voices, slower conversation, the scrape of chairs being pushed back. Someone was proposing a toast. She could hear Edith's voice clearly over the others, talking about the farm's upcoming winter plans as though she were delivering a quarterly report. Martha began to fill the wash basin. She had been washing dishes for this family since she was 8 years old. Her arms remembered the motion without being asked. Hot water when there was hot water, cold when there wasn't. She'd had cold water enough times to know the difference. She was elbow deep in the basin when Edith came in. "The man outside," Edith said. She pulled the kitchen door mostly closed behind her, which meant this was not a public conversation. "What did he say to you?" Martha kept washing. "He asked about the venison." "He asked about the venison." Edith said it the way you repeated something when you didn't believe it. "For an hour. We talked." "About what?" Martha looked at her. "Cooking," she said. "Farming. The usual things people talk about." Edith studied her. Edith had a particular way of studying people that made you feel like she was looking for the structural weakness in a building. "He's new to the county," she said. "He doesn't know how things work." "He seemed to understand well enough," Martha said. "Martha." Edith's voice dropped into its lower register, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. That man is a stranger. He doesn't know your situation. He doesn't know the family. You shouldn't... She stopped, reframed. You shouldn't give people the wrong impression. Martha looked at her aunt steadily. What impression would that be? That you're available to sit outside with any man who rides up. The washwater was very hot. Martha focused on that, on the clean feeling of it. I was already outside, she said. Edith's jaw moved slightly. I simply mean, I know what you mean, Martha said. Her voice was even. She went back to the dishes. After a moment, Edith left. Martha washed. She washed every pot and every plate and every serving dish, and she dried them and stacked them and put them away in the places she knew by feel in the dark. It took a long time. It always took a long time. She was drying the last pan when she heard the voices rise in the dining room. Not the comfortable rise of people having fun, a sharper rise, the kind that happened when something unexpected landed in the middle of a conversation. She set down the pan. She moved to the door and pushed it open an inch. Silas had come inside. She could see him from the partial angle of the doorway, standing near the head of the table where Edith's husband, Robert, was seated. Robert was a broad, quiet man who deferred to Edith in most things and had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being in a room without causing trouble. He was looking at Silas with an expression Martha couldn't fully read from the angle. Edith was at the other end of the table, and she had the careful stillness of someone who had just heard something they needed time to process. She cooked everything on that table, Silas was saying. His voice was conversational, not accusing, just saying a thing that happened to be true. Every dish. I'm curious, does she always eat outside, or is this a special occasion? The room was quiet in the particular way of people who knew the answer and were hoping someone else would give it. Harold shifted in his chair. That's just how it... Because I sat with her for an hour, Silas said, still conversational, still without heat. And she told me about every dish on this table. She told me about the bread ratios and the venison brine and the apple pies. She told me she figured out the biscuits last winter. He picked up one of the remaining biscuits from the basket in the center of the table and looked at it. These are the best biscuits I've eaten in this state. I want to be clear about that. He put it back. I just wondered why the person who made everything I ate tonight is eating outside in 35-degree wind. The silence stretched. Edith's voice was perfectly controlled when she spoke. This is a family matter, Mr. Rowan. I imagine it is, he said. He looked at her with the same steady, flat attention he'd turned on everything else. I'm not trying to get in the middle of a family matter. I'm a stranger. I just got here. A pause. I'm simply saying that the food was extraordinary and the cook should be at the table. He looked around the room once. Not searching, not accusing, just looking. And then he nodded at Robert and walked back through the kitchen toward the side door. He paused in the kitchen. Martha stepped back from the door, but he'd probably known she was there. Good evening, Martha, he said, not looking at her directly, giving her the dignity of not being caught eavesdropping. Thank you for dinner. She heard the side door open and close. Inside the dining room, the silence held for another 3 seconds, and then fractured into a dozen low conversations happening simultaneously, the way people talked when they were processing something they weren't ready to discuss out loud. Martha stood in the kitchen. Her hands were still slightly damp from the washing. The kitchen was warm. From outside, she could hear Silas's horse moving, the soft sound of hooves on the frozen ground going north. She turned back to the counter and picked up the pan she'd set down. She didn't know what to think about Silas Rowan. She wasn't sure she trusted him entirely. She'd lived long enough to know that men who appeared at the right moment and said the right things weren't automatically what they appeared to be. People had agendas, even good-seeming ones, but she thought about the biscuit he'd picked up and set back down. The way he'd said, "These are the best biscuits I've eaten in this state," like it was a simple fact requiring no embellishment. She'd made those biscuits. She'd made everything on that table, and she'd been eating them on a wooden crate outside. She put the pan away on the shelf. She heard Edith's voice in the dining room, clear and decisive, cutting through the murmur and redirecting the conversation towards something else entirely. The kind of authority that closed doors on things that had been opened. Martha knew that voice. She had organized her entire life around that voice. She untied her apron and hung it on the hook beside the stove. Her feet still hurt, her back still ached. She was tired in the specific, textured way of someone who had been physically working for 13 hours without real rest. She thought about the walk back to the small room at the rear of the house that had been hers since childhood. The narrow bed, the one window that faced east, the draft that came under the door in winter. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, in the quiet. She wasn't sure exactly what had shifted. Something had, though. Something quiet and tectonic, the way the ground shifted sometimes in the mountains. Not visible from the outside, not announced, but real. She could feel it under her feet without being able to name it yet. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Behind her, the dining room was still talking. She didn't listen. She slept badly and woke before 4, which was not unusual, except that this time she lay in the dark for a while instead of getting up immediately. The ceiling of her small room was familiar in the way only things you've stared at for years can be. Every water stain mapped, every crack in the plaster memorized without intending to. She knew the exact place where the draft came in under the door and curled around the foot of the bed. She knew the sound the house made at this hour, the deep, settling creak of old wood contracting in the cold. She had been sleeping in this room since she was 11 years old. She thought about what Silas had said. Not the part in the dining room. She'd been turning that over all night, feeling complicated things about it she hadn't fully sorted, but the earlier part. On the crate. "Do you?" he'd asked, when she'd said you got used to the shape of things. And she'd told him the truth, which she almost never did, which surprised her even now thinking about it. Not really. You just get tired enough that the shape stops feeling sharp. She'd meant it as a practical observation. She hadn't meant it to sound as sad as it apparently did. She got up at 4:30. She put on her wool stockings and her heavy dress and the cardigan with the broken button on the third eyelet that she kept meaning to fix. She went downstairs. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, clean, cold, quiet. She lit the stove and put the kettle on and stood with her hands around the cold metal of the coffee pot waiting for it to warm, looking out the small window above the sink at the total darkness outside. The family would begin leaving today. Some of them would be gone by morning, some by afternoon, and by evening the house would contract back to its usual population: Edith, Robert, Harold, and Martha. 4 people in a house that had always felt designed to hold more, which was a particular kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of rattling around in a space built for a version of things that no longer existed. She heard footsteps upstairs. Then the pipes. Someone was up early. She started the coffee and began pulling things from the pantry for breakfast. By the time Edith came downstairs at 6:15, Martha had eggs on and bread toasted and a full pot of coffee already half gone because several cousins had appeared in the kitchen in the preceding hour, poured themselves cups without asking, and wandered back out again. This was also not unusual. Edith looked at the stove, then at Martha, and then at the kitchen in general with the assessment gaze Martha had catalogued hundreds of times. She poured herself coffee and sat at the small table near the window, the kitchen table, not the dining room, which she only did when she had something to say that she didn't want the rest of the house to hear. Martha kept her back to her and tended the eggs. "That man came back," Edith said. Martha turned slightly. "What?" "This morning, before I came down. Robert spoke to him at the door." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "He left something." "Left what?" Edith set an envelope on the table. It was a plain envelope, not sealed, the kind you bought at any dry goods store. Martha's name was written on the front in handwriting that was economical and precise, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write for function rather than elegance. Martha looked at it from across the kitchen. "I didn't open it," Edith said. Her voice was doing the careful thing again, the controlled neutral thing that meant she was managing something. "Though I'd like to know what business a man I've never met has sending letters to my niece the morning after he showed up uninvited at my dinner table." "He was invited," Martha said. "You invited him yourself, in front of me." "I invited him inside," Edith said. "He declined." Martha crossed to the table and picked up the envelope. She didn't open it in front of Edith. She put it in the pocket of her cardigan. Edith watched this. "Martha," "I'll look at it later," Martha said, and went back to the eggs before they burned. The kitchen held a particular silence after that. Not comfortable, not hostile, just charged. The kind of silence that happened in the space between what two people were saying and what they actually meant. Martha understood Edith's silences as well as she understood the kitchen. She'd had enough years of practice with both. She did not take the envelope out of her pocket until she was in the barn an hour later, alone, ostensibly checking on the two horses they kept through winter. She leaned against the stall door with the smell of hay and cold animal warmth around her and opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, and beneath it, something else. A document, folded separately, older, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. She read the note first. Martha. I found this during the title search when I purchased the Hendricks land. It was filed with the county clerk's office in Bitterroot County, cross-referenced in the adjacent parcel records. I don't know if you know about it. I thought you should. S. Rowan. I'll be at the land office Monday if you have questions or want to talk about what it means. She set the note on the stall rail and unfolded the other document carefully, because it was old enough that the fold lines were fragile. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. Her eyes moved over the legal language, the way eyes moved over things they weren't prepared for. Skipping, backing up, starting again. It was a deed of transfer, filed 15 years ago with the county clerk's office of Bitterroot County, Wyoming, signed by her grandmother, Nora Calloway, transferring ownership of the farmhouse and 40 surrounding acres to Martha Ann Calloway, then age 19. She read it a second time, then a third. Her grandmother's signature was at the bottom. She recognized it. She had seen that signature on birthday cards and the backs of photographs and the occasional letter that arrived when her grandmother had been in her final years and too unwell to visit. The signature was slightly shaky. Her grandmother's hands had trembled by the end, but it was unmistakably hers. Below it was the notary stamp, and below that the clerk's filing information, with a date that corresponded to the autumn before her grandmother died. Martha stood very still in the barn. Outside, the Wyoming sky was doing the thing it did on cold November mornings, going from gray to a pale, washed-out blue that looked more like the memory of color than the thing itself. A horse moved in the adjacent stall. The hay shifted. She had been 19 years old when her grandmother filed this document. She was 34 now, 15 years. She had lived in this house for 15 years, believing she was a dependent. Believing she had no ground to stand on that wasn't given to her by the goodwill of the people around her. She had cooked and cleaned and carried and served and eaten outside in the cold, and the entire time, the house beneath her feet had been hers. Her legs found the barn wall without her telling them to. She leaned against it and slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor with the deed in her lap and the note on the stall rail above her, and the horse looking at her with the patient, disinterested gaze of animals who had seen everything and were impressed by none of it. She didn't cry. She wanted to, but couldn't locate it yet. What she felt was something more like the specific vertigo of a floor dropping out from under you. Not the falling part, but the moment just before, when your body knows before your mind does, and your stomach goes hollow and cold. She thought about Edith standing in the kitchen doorway at 5 a.m, the day after her grandmother's funeral, looking at the house with its rooms and its pantry and its acres of good land and saying, "We'll need to sort out the arrangements. Martha, you'll stay on and help with the household." And Martha, 20 years old and raw with grief, and not knowing anything about land deeds or county records, had simply said yes. Because what else did you say when you were 20 and just lost the only person who had made you feel entirely safe? She thought about every year after that, every harvest, every meal, every time Edith had made a decision about the land and the livestock and the buildings without consulting her, every time Martha had raised a quiet question and been told patiently, "I've handled it, Martha. You don't need to worry about that." She'd been kept from worrying about it. She'd been kept from knowing about it. She'd been kept, period. The words sat in her chest like a coal. She thought about Silas Rowan, who had ridden up at dusk with a question about hay and ended up sitting on a wooden crate in the cold, and who had apparently discovered this document during the routine paperwork of buying adjacent land and had brought it directly to her. Not to Robert, not to Edith, to her, because it was hers. She sat on the barn floor for a long time. Eventually, the cold got into her bones enough that she had to move. She got up. She folded the deed carefully along its original lines, and then less carefully because her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in her pocket. She went inside. The house was in the controlled chaos of a family dispersing, bags coming downstairs, goodbyes being said in the hallway, children being located and coded and pushed toward doors. Martha moved through it without being fully present. She answered when people spoke to her. She helped her cousin Dottie find a scarf that turned out to be under a chair in the sitting room. She accepted a brief hug from an aunt whose name she could never fully keep straight. Nobody looked at her closely enough to notice that something was different. This was not surprising. Nobody had been looking at her closely for a very long time. By 11 o'clock, the house was down to its usual 4. Harold had gone into town. Robert was in the office going over accounts. Edith was in the sitting room with a cup of tea and a list of something, her reading glasses on, her pen moving. Martha came and stood in the doorway of the sitting room. Edith looked up. "I need to speak with you," Martha said. Edith looked at her for a moment. Something in Martha's face must have been different, because Edith set her pen down rather than holding it, which was what she did when she intended to give partial attention. Putting the pen down meant full attention. "All right," she said. Martha came in and sat in the chair across from her. Not the chair she usually occupied when Edith summoned her to discuss household matters. A chair slightly further to the side, lower than Edith's by virtue of the furniture arrangement. She sat in the chair directly across, so they were level. She took the envelope from her pocket and set it on the table between them. Edith looked at it. Her face did something very small and very fast that Martha almost missed, and then it went still and careful. "Where did you get that?" she said. And there it was. Not "what is that?" Not "what's this about?" She knew what it was. The question was only about how it had gotten here. Martha felt something settle inside her. Not anger, something colder and more certain than anger. "Silas Rowan found it during his title search," she said. "It was filed with the county records." Edith's hands were in her lap. Martha could see them from the edge of her vision. Her aunt's hands, which were always doing something, always moving, now completely still. "Martha," Edith began. "Is it real?" Martha asked. "It's Edith." Martha's voice was quiet, but there was nothing yielding in it. Something had changed in the night and in the barn and in the sitting on a cold floor trying to understand 15 years of a life. "Is the document real? Yes or no?" A long pause. "Yes," Edith said. Her voice was a very small thing suddenly. The room held that for a moment. "Tell me why," Martha said. Edith set her tea down. She took her reading glasses off and folded them with the precise, slow movements of someone who needed something to do with their hands. "Your grandmother meant well," she said, "but she wasn't practical. She had ideas about independence that didn't account for reality. A woman alone, managing land, no husband, no—" "She meant for me to have it," Martha said. "She meant for you to have it when you were ready," Edith said, and her voice found its footing again, the reasonable tone, the one that had always made Martha feel like she was missing something obvious. "Martha, you were 19. You didn't know anything about land management. You didn't know about the liens, the seasonal costs, the water rights. You would have been taken advantage of inside of a year. I protected you." "You protected me," Martha repeated. "Yes. For 15 years. Yes." Martha looked at her aunt. She had spent a very long time in the same room as this woman, had watched her manage everything and everyone with the same precise, controlled authority, had accepted, without examining it, that authority as something closer to expertise than appetite, had never, until this moment, sat across from her as an equal with something in her hand that proved she was one. "You kept the income from the land," Martha said. It wasn't a question. She was working it out as she said it, the math of it. The 40 acres were grazing acres mostly. They'd brought in rental income from a neighboring rancher for years. She'd never been told the amount. She'd never been told there was an amount. Edith's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The money was put back into the property. "I'd like to see the records," Martha said. "Martha, I'd like to see them," she said again, still quiet, still level. "And I'd like to speak with Robert." "Robert doesn't have anything to do with Edith." One word, firm as a fence post. The silence that followed was different from the silences Martha was used to. Those had always had Edith at the center of them, controlling their length and what went into them and when they ended. This one had a different center. Edith seemed to feel it. Her shoulders, always straight, drew back very slightly and then dropped a fraction of an inch that she probably didn't notice and Martha would not have noticed 6 months ago. Robert came in from the hallway. He had the slightly uncertain look of a man who had heard voices at a particular register and come to see whether intervention was needed, not entirely sure whether he was the right person for the job. "Robert," Martha said before Edith could speak, "did you know about this?" She nodded toward the envelope. Robert looked at his wife, and in that look was everything. The quick calculation, the long habit of deferral, the particular guilt of someone who had known something and decided knowing it quietly was the same as not knowing it at all. "I knew your grandmother intended to leave you the property," he said carefully. "Intended," Martha said. "I wasn't aware the deed had been filed," he said, which was, Martha noticed, a very specific sentence. Not, "I didn't know." Not, "Edith never told me." It was precise in the way of sentences that were technically accurate and entirely evasive. "Robert," Edith said. One syllable, a warning. He looked at the floor. Martha picked up the envelope and stood. Her legs were steady. She hadn't been sure they would be, but they were. "I'm going to speak with the county clerk on Monday," she said. She looked at her aunt. "I'm going to have the deed verified and the property properly recorded in my name. I'd like the financial records for the land going back 15 years within the week." Edith looked up at her. For the first time in Martha's memory, her aunt looked her full age. Not diminished. Edith Calloway would never be diminished. It wasn't in her constitution. But real. Human. The architecture of her authority was still there, but you could see now it was architecture, that there were walls and not just will. "You're not equipped to manage that property alone," Edith said. Her voice was even, but something underneath it had gone tired. "That's not an insult. It's practical." "It might be," Martha said, "but it's mine to figure out." She paused at the doorway. "I'll be at the land office Monday morning. After that, I'll need to start arranging to move my things to the farmhouse." "Martha, that house hasn't been properly maintained in years. It needs—" "I know what it needs," Martha said. "I used to visit it with grandmother. I know every room in it." She left the sitting room. She went upstairs. She went to her small room with the east-facing window, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she held the envelope in both hands, and she looked at the wall. She thought about her grandmother. Nora Calloway had been a small woman, slight in the way of people who had been working their whole lives, with a laugh that surprised you every time because it was bigger than she was. She had grown tomatoes in the kitchen window in winter, and read everything she could find, and had told Martha more than once that the greatest thing a person could own was something that didn't go away when they walked out of a room. She'd meant land. She'd meant the 40 acres and the farmhouse she'd built with her first husband before he passed. She'd meant all of it, and she'd meant Martha to have it. And she'd filed the paperwork and put her shaking signature on it, and apparently trusted that the people around her would do the right thing. They had not done the right thing. Martha pressed the envelope flat against her knee. Her grandmother had loved her. She had known that, had held on to that knowing through all the years in this house, the way you held on to one solid thing when everything else was uncertain ground. And the solid thing was real. It had always been real. It had just been a different shape than she'd understood. She heard Harold's truck coming up the road from town in the early afternoon, heard the door, heard his voice in the front room, heard Edith's voice lower than usual, heard Harold say something short and then go quiet. She sat on her bed. She did not go downstairs for lunch. Around 3 o'clock, she heard a knock at her door. Not Edith's knock. 2 precise raps, always 2. This was 4, slightly uneven. Harold. Martha. His voice through the door was uncertain, which was unusual for Harold. Harold was uncertain about very few things. "Can I talk to you for a second?" She considered. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame. He was a big man, and the door frame made him look slightly too large for the space, which she'd always found vaguely appropriate. He looked around the room the way people looked around rooms when they were avoiding direct eye contact, taking inventory of things they'd never noticed before. "I didn't know," he said. "About the deed." She looked at him. She didn't say anything. "I mean, I knew grandmother left you stuff. I knew there was property involved." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I figured Mom had sorted it out legally. I didn't ask." A pause. "I should have asked." "Yes," Martha said. You should have. He nodded. He was waiting for something. Forgiveness, maybe, or the softening that usually followed when Martha was upset about something, because Martha had always been the kind of person who softened eventually, who let things go, who smoothed the edges of conflict because someone had to. He was waiting for that. She looked at him steadily and did not provide it. Right, he said after a moment. All right. He looked at the floor. If you need help moving things to the farmhouse, I'll let you know, she said. He nodded again and left. She sat in the quiet room. Outside her window, the Wyoming sky was going the particular deep blue of late afternoon in November, the color that preceded darkness and came in very fast this time of year. The trees along the fence line were bare and stark against it. She thought about Monday, the land office, the clerk's desk and the deed and her name on it in her grandmother's shaking hand. She thought about what Silas had written, "I thought you should know," and about the fact that he had thought this, had decided it, and had acted on it without making it into anything larger than it was. Had just brought her the information and stepped back. She thought that was a rarer thing than it sounded. She thought about the farmhouse, which she had last been inside when she was 19 and her grandmother was still alive and the windows were clean and there was a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood soap and the particular combination of smells that she associated with the truest feeling of being somewhere she belonged. She needed to see it. She needed to see it before Monday. She needed to know what was there and what was broken and what would need work, and she needed to stand in it with the deed in her hand and make it real in a way that it wasn't yet. She got up. She put on her coat. She put the envelope in the inside breast pocket, where it sat against her chest. She went downstairs and out the side door, the way she always did, and turned north across the cold field toward the small farmhouse a quarter-mile away that she had not set foot in for 15 years. The grass was frozen and brittle under her boots. The sky was going dark at the edges. She walked steadily, with the particular feeling of a person moving toward something rather than away, which was a feeling she did not have very much practice with. Behind her, the main house with its lit windows and its familiar walls and its 15 years of accumulated silence shrank with distance. She kept walking. The farmhouse appeared slowly out of the blue dusk, small and square, and a little tilted where the foundation had settled on one side, with two front windows dark and a porch that had lost one railing post to weather. The oak tree her grandmother had planted beside the east wall was enormous now, the way trees got enormous while you weren't watching. She stopped when she reached the porch. She stood in the cold with the deed against her chest and looked at the house. It wasn't beautiful. It needed work. She could see that even in the failing light. The porch boards would need replacing. The window on the left had a crack she'd need to deal with before deep winter. The door had shifted in its frame from the settled foundation and probably stuck. But it was standing, and it was hers. She put her hand on the porch railing, and the wood was cold and solid under her palm. And she stood there for a minute and breathed, and the breath came out in a long white cloud that the wind took and scattered. The door did stick. She had to put her shoulder into it, but it opened. She stepped inside. The inside of the farmhouse smelled like 15 years of no one living in it. Dust and cold stone, and the particular dry emptiness of rooms that had been closed too long. But underneath that, if she stood still enough and breathed slowly enough, there was something else, something older. Wood soap and something faintly sweet that she couldn't name but recognized in her body before her mind caught up. Her grandmother had been in every corner of this place. In the way the shelves were built, lower than standard, because Nora Calloway had been a small woman and didn't see any reason to build inconvenience into her own home. In the window above the kitchen basin that faced east, specifically east, because her grandmother had believed the first thing you should see in the morning was the sunrise and not the barn. In the extra-wide sill on that same window, deep enough to set pots of herbs on, which Martha could see even in the dim light still held the ghost rings of clay pots long removed. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then she went to the window and looked east and could see, even in the near dark, the flat line of the horizon with the last of the daylight bleeding out above it. She didn't have a lamp. She hadn't thought to bring one. She walked through the house by the remaining gray light coming through the windows, moving carefully because she didn't know what the floors were like after 15 years of no maintenance heat. No one walking them, no one noticing when a board started to give. Some of them were soft underfoot. The one in the hallway near the back bedroom had a distinct flex to it that she'd need to deal with. The bedroom itself was cold and bare, stripped down to just the frame of what it had been, but the ceiling was sound and the window intact, and when she pushed the door, it swung freely on its hinges without complaint. She saved the kitchen for last, went back to it after she'd been through the rest of the house and made her rough inventory. Foundation solid on 3 sides, tilted on the northwest corner, but not dangerously. Roof appeared intact, though she'd need to check the attic space for leaks. 2 windows with cracked glazing, one seriously enough to let cold air in. Porch needing significant work. Interior walls in reasonable shape below the waterline of dust and disuse. The kitchen was the largest room. Her grandmother had made sure of that, had said once, in Martha's hearing, that you could forgive a house a lot of shortcomings if the kitchen was right. The fireplace in the kitchen had a wide iron grate and a bread oven built into the side of it, a feature that Martha had forgotten about until she saw it and felt something move in her chest. She crouched down and looked inside the bread oven. Clean. Intact. The iron door still seated properly in its frame. She sat back on her heels on the kitchen floor. The deed was still in her inside pocket. She hadn't taken it out since the barn that morning. She put her hand over it through the fabric of her coat and held it there for a moment, not dramatically, just acknowledging it. The way you acknowledge something real. She was going to fix this house. She didn't know exactly how. She had some money of her own, not much, accumulated carefully over years in the way of someone who had learned that small amounts saved consistently were the only financial security available to them. She had skills that could be traded, she had a clear head for what the work required, and a practical understanding of what could be done in what order. She was not going in blind. She got up off the kitchen floor, brushed her knees off, and went back out through the sticking front door into the cold. The walk back across the field felt different than the walk out had. Going, she'd been moving towards something uncertain. Coming back, she was moving away from something that had become, in the space of one afternoon, completely solid. The farmhouse was behind her now, and she could feel it there the way you felt a thing you'd decided on. Not pulling at her, just present. Real. The main house lights were on when she came across the field. Through the dining room window, she could see the shape of Edith at the table, sitting with something in front of her, and the flicker of Robert passing behind her. The ordinary movements of a household evening. She went in through the side door. She hung up her coat. She went upstairs without stopping in the kitchen. She sat on her bed and she thought for a very long time about what came next. Monday arrived gray and cold with a wind off the plains that meant business. Martha was up at 4 out of habit and found she didn't need to go through the kitchen and start breakfast because she lay in bed until 5:30 instead, staring at the ceiling, doing math in her head. Calculating what she had, what she needed, what order the repairs had to happen in to make the farmhouse livable before the worst of winter settled in. She was at the county land office when it opened at 8 o'clock. The clerk was a woman named Agnes Perrin, who had worked the land office for 22 years and had the particular efficiency of someone who had processed enough human drama across her desk that nothing surprised her anymore. She took the deed, examined it with reading glasses pushed up on her nose, cross-referenced something in a large bound ledger, cross-referenced it again in a newer file, and then looked at Martha over her glasses. "This is in order," Agnes said. "Filed correctly. Notarized. The original recording is here." She turned the ledger around and showed Martha the entry, the deed number, the date, her grandmother's name, her own name. Neat handwriting in black ink, 15 years old. Real as anything in the world. "You've been the legal owner of that property since this was filed," Agnes said, without particular emphasis. She was just stating what the record showed. "Yes," Martha said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "You'll want a certified copy," Agnes said. "I can have that ready for you end of day." "Please," Martha said. She was back outside on the wooden sidewalk in front of the land office by 8:20, with the cold wind coming down the main street and the town beginning its morning business around her. She stood for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. Silas Rowan's voice came from her left. "How'd it go?" She turned. He was coming out of the feed store 2 doors down carrying a paper bag, and he'd clearly seen her go into the land office and waited. He looked like he wasn't sure if that was the right call and had done it anyway. "It's real," she said. He nodded once. "I figured." "Agnes Perrin says I've been the legal owner for 15 years. He nodded again, slower this time. Yeah, he said. He didn't say anything else about it. He seemed to understand that there wasn't anything useful to add. They stood on the sidewalk. You got a minute? He asked. There's a place down the street, coffee. She looked at him. He was holding the paper bag from the feed store and his hat was pulled down against the wind, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had stumbled into someone else's story by buying adjacent land and had decided, apparently, to stay in it. All right, she said. The coffee place was a small room with 4 tables and a counter run by a man named Pete, who seemed to have 2 settings, efficient and absent, and was currently in the second one, standing at the back with a newspaper. Silas ordered 2 coffees without asking her how she took hers, and then, when they were sitting across from each other with the cups between them, said, Milk? Sugar? Just black, she said. Good, he said, and pushed his cup toward his side of the table and wrapped both hands around it. I talked to Edith yesterday, Martha said. I figured you would. She admitted it. She knew about the deed. She said she was protecting me. She said the last part without particular inflection, just reporting it. Silas looked at his coffee. Do you think she believed that? Martha considered it. She had been considering it since yesterday afternoon, actually, because it was the question that mattered more than it should have, and she hadn't been able to get clear of it. Whether Edith had told herself a story about protection and half believed it, or whether it had been plain calculation dressed in the language of care. Maybe at first, she said finally. For the first year, maybe 2. After that, I think she got used to it. Got used to the arrangement and stopped examining it. People do that, he said. They do, she agreed. He looked up at her. What are you going to do? She put both hands around her own cup. I'm going to fix the farmhouse. Move in before December if I can manage the most urgent repairs. I went through it yesterday evening. How bad is it? Bad enough that I need to be smart about the order. The porch is the most visible problem, but not the most urgent. There's a northwest foundation corner that worries me more, and 2 windows with broken glazing I need to deal with before the hard freeze. She paused. The kitchen fireplace is intact. The bread oven still works. The roof looks sound from inside, though I need to check the attic. He was listening the way he listened to everything, fully, without his attention wandering, without the polite look of someone waiting for their turn to talk. She noticed this because it was different from most listening she experienced. Most people listened to the parts of what she said that applied to them and let the rest go. I know a man who does foundations, he said, does good work and doesn't pad his estimate. I can give you his name. I'd appreciate that, she said. Window glazing I can do, he said. That's not complicated. I've got the tools. She looked at him. That's not an imposition, he said, before she could say it. It's a morning's work. I've got mornings. Silas, she said. Martha, he said back with precisely nothing in his voice. She was quiet for a second. I need to do this myself, she said. Not all of it. I know I can't. But enough of it that it's mine. That it's not just another situation where I'm standing in the middle of something someone else has managed for me. He looked at her levelly. I know, he said. I'm offering to help you fix a window, not manage your life. She looked at him. He looked back. There's a difference, he said. I know there's a difference, she said. Good, he said. Then drink your coffee. She drank her coffee. Outside the window, Main Street went about its Monday business. A wagon going past, 2 women talking on the opposite sidewalk, the blacksmith shop 2 doors down beginning to sound like itself. I need to speak with the family, she said. All of them, not just Edith. She'd been turning this over since Sunday. The harvest gathering was dispersed, but most of the relatives lived within a day's ride. I need them to know what happened, not to punish anyone, just because they watched it. For 15 years they watched the arrangement and didn't ask questions. And some of them are good people who would have asked if they'd known there was something to ask about. She paused. And some of them aren't, and they should know I know. Silas nodded slowly. When? I'm going to write letters today. Ask them to come back. 1 more gathering, at the farmhouse this time. She looked at her coffee cup. My house. He was quiet for a moment. Do you want someone there with you? She looked up. When they come, he said. I'm not suggesting you need backup. I'm asking if you'd want it. She thought about it honestly, which meant thinking about what she actually wanted rather than what she thought she should want. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." He nodded. "Then I'll be there." The letters went out Tuesday. By Thursday, 3 families had sent word back. By Saturday, all but 2 of the harvest gathering had confirmed they'd come the following Tuesday, and the 2 who hadn't were an uncle who lived 3 counties away and a cousin who had a new baby and couldn't travel, which Martha understood on both counts. She spent the intervening days at the farmhouse. Monday, she borrowed Robert's wagon and moved the most essential things: her bedding, her clothes, the small box of things that had been her mother's, the box of her grandmother's letters she'd kept hidden under the floorboard of her room for 8 years because they were the only things in the house that were entirely hers. She also took the cast iron skillet. It had been in the main house kitchen, technically under Edith's roof, but it had been her mother's skillet before that, and she took it without asking, and no one said anything. She slept the first night in the farmhouse, wrapped in every blanket she owned, with the kitchen fireplace going full and the cold still getting in through the cracked window, until Silas showed up at 7 the next morning with glazing compound and the tools to apply it, as he'd said he would. He worked on the windows. She worked on clearing 15 years of accumulated dust and grime from the surfaces that needed to be surfaces again. They worked in the same house without being in each other's way, which she had expected to be awkward and was not. He had the quality some people had of being simply present without requiring management, without generating a kind of social debt that had to be serviced. She'd been around enough people who couldn't enter a room without changing its atmosphere to recognize and be deeply relieved by someone who could. He left by noon. He came back the next morning and finished the second window. He brought the name of the foundation man, written on a card in that same economical handwriting. She wrote to the foundation man on Wednesday. He came out Thursday, looked at the northwest corner for 20 minutes, gave her a number that was fair and a timeline of 2 weeks. She agreed and paid him half up front from the careful money she'd saved, and felt the specific feeling of spending money on something that was genuinely yours. Different from any other kind of spending, weighted differently, more real. By Tuesday morning, the day of the gathering, the farmhouse was not finished. It was going to take months to finish it properly, and she knew that. The porch still needed work. The hallway floor had 2 soft boards she'd marked with chalk and stepped around. The northwest corner would be shored up over the coming 2 weeks. But the windows were whole, the kitchen was warm and clean, and there was food on the table. She had been cooking since Monday evening, not out of obligation this time, out of something that felt entirely different from obligation, something that had its own warmth and its own intention. She had made biscuits. She'd made a venison stew and a dried apple cake and a pot of beans that had been going since Sunday, in the low heat the way her grandmother had taught her, long and slow until they were exactly right. The farmhouse kitchen smelled the way it should smell. She had set a table. Not the long harvest table of the main house. This table was smaller, round, pulled from the back room where it had been stored. It seated 8 comfortably. She had borrowed chairs. She had set places for everyone who was coming. She had set a place for herself at the head. They arrived between 10 and noon, in 2s and 3s, coming up the path from the main road on horses and in wagons, looking at the farmhouse with the curiosity of people who had not thought about it in years and were now recalibrating. Some of them she could read from a distance. Dottie, nervous, checking her husband's face. Harold, carefully neutral, keeping his hands in his pockets. Her Uncle Gerald, with his particular shuffling walk that meant he was already uncomfortable and getting more so. Edith came last. She came alone on her good mare, and she dismounted at the porch without being helped and tied the horse to the railing post and walked up the porch steps with her back straight and her face controlled, and she looked at Martha standing in the doorway of her own house. And something passed between them that didn't have a clean name. "Come in," Martha said. They came in. 14 people in the small farmhouse made it feel full in a way that was different from the main house gatherings. Tighter, more immediate. No long hallway to retreat down. No separate sitting room to escape to. They were all in the same space, and they knew it. Martha let them settle. Let them find places to stand or sit. Let them take in the kitchen with its smell of food and the fire going and the table set. She watched their faces. She had spent her whole life watching faces in rooms, and she was good at it. When the movement and the low talking settled into something like attention, she spoke. "Thank you for coming," she said. She didn't start with an explanation of why she'd called them. She started with something she meant. Most of you I've known my whole life. You were at my mother's funeral. Some of you were at my grandmother's. You've been to this ranch for harvests every year I can remember. And I've cooked for every one of those gatherings. Nobody said anything. Last Thursday, I found out that my grandmother left me this farmhouse and 40 acres in a legal deed filed 15 years ago. I didn't know. Edith knew. She didn't say it with heat, she just said it. I'd like her to confirm that so no one thinks this is a misunderstanding. Every face in the room turned toward Edith. Edith, standing near the window, held herself still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I knew about the deed." The room shifted, not dramatically, just a settling, like weight being redistributed. "She said she did it to protect me," Martha said. "I'm not going to argue about what she believed, but I want you all to understand what it meant in practice, because you were there for all of it." She looked around the room. "I cooked every harvest meal for 15 years without knowing I owned the kitchen I cooked it in. I was told where to eat and where to sit and when to speak, and every one of you sat at that table and ate food I made and watched it happen." She paused. "Let that land. I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty. I'm here because I think you deserve to know the truth, and I think I deserved witnesses when I said it out loud." Dottie had her hand over her mouth. Harold was looking at the floor. Gerald's shuffling had stopped. Martha. It was her Aunt Patricia, Edith's younger sister, a rounder, quieter woman who had always moved carefully in Edith's shadow, the way people moved carefully around things that might fall. "I didn't know," she said, "about the deed. I want you to know that." "I believe you," Martha said. "That's not why I called you here." She looked around the room again. "I called you here because I'm starting something new in this house, and I want the people I've known my whole life to know where I am." She looked at Edith last. Edith, who was watching her with an expression that Martha had never seen on her face in 34 years. Not broken, not diminished, but stripped of something. The particular stripping of a person who has been seen clearly by someone they thought would never look directly at them. "I don't hate you," Martha said. She said it quietly, just to her aunt, though the room was small enough that everyone heard. "What you did cost me 15 years. I don't know yet what I would have done with those years. Maybe not much. Maybe something." She looked at her steadily. "But they were mine to waste or use, and you took that. I want you to know that I know." Edith's jaw moved. For a moment, just a moment, something behind her eyes shifted, and Martha thought she was going to say something real, something without the architecture of control around it. What she said was, "I'm sorry, Martha," and her voice was small and careful, and probably the truest sound Martha had ever heard come out of her. It wasn't enough. Martha didn't pretend it was enough, but it was real, and real was more than she'd expected. She nodded. Then she went to the stove. "The food's ready," she said. "Sit down." They sat. All 14 of them, around the small round table and along the windowsill and on the extra chairs, and Martha served from the kitchen of her own house and sat down at the head of the table she had set. And she ate her food while the people around her ate, and the fire went in the grate, and the Wyoming light came in through the new glazing on the east window. Silas was there. He'd come in quietly during the gathering, stood near the back, said nothing. He had a cup of coffee she'd pressed into his hand when he arrived, and he'd been holding it ever since. He caught her eye once across the room during the silence that followed Edith's apology, and he gave her a small nod. Just that, nothing more. And she looked away and focused on what was in front of her. After the meal, people cleared the table without being asked, which was new and noticed and not remarked upon. Conversations happened in small groups around the room. Gerald found her at the stove and said, awkwardly, "The beans are something else, Martha," which was his version of an apology, and she accepted it as such. Dottie lingered longest. She helped with the washing up, standing at the basin beside Martha, passing dishes without being asked the right sequence, which meant she'd watched how it was done. "I should have said something," Dottie said, "that night, when she told you to go outside." She scrubbed at a pot without looking up. "I didn't. I just sat there." "I know," Martha said. "Martha, I think I told myself it was a family thing, between you and Edith, that it wasn't my place." She handed the pot over to be rinsed. "But I was just... It was easier, not saying anything." She finally looked up. That's not an excuse. I just want you to know I know that. Martha looked at her cousin. Dottie was 20, which was very young to understand the difference between an excuse and an admission. I know you know, she said. By 4 o'clock, the farmhouse was quiet again. The fire had settled into its lower afternoon state. The dishes were done and put away in the cabinets that were hers, on the shelves her grandmother had built at the right height. Silas was on the porch when she came out, looking north toward his land, which was visible from here as a line of fence posts running toward the low hills. He had his coat on and his hat, and he looked like he was in no particular hurry, which was one of the things she was beginning to understand was simply part of how he existed in the world. He moved at the pace of a man who had made his peace with the fact that most things took the time they took. She came and stood beside him on the porch. Well, she said. Yeah, he said. The wind had dropped in the afternoon to something more manageable. The sky was the high, clear blue that came after cold fronts moved through. From the porch, she could see the main house to the south, smaller from here than it had ever felt when she was living in it. How are you? He asked. She thought about it. She was tired. She was something that wasn't quite sad and wasn't quite relieved, some combination of the two that didn't have its own word. She was also, underneath those things, something quieter and more solid that she kept touching like a bruise to see if it was still there. It was. It would be for a while. I've been worse, she said. That's a start, he said. She looked at the horizon. Thank you, she said, for the letter, for being here. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't do much, he said. You found the deed, she said. You could have, I don't know, filed it away. Assumed someone knew. It wasn't your problem. No, he said. It wasn't. He said it the way someone said something that explained itself. She looked at him. He was looking at the fence line. Why? She asked. She'd been wanting to ask it since Thursday. He thought about it for a second. Because it was yours, he said. And because whoever you are is somebody who deserved to know what they had. She stood with that for a moment. The farmhouse was behind her, its kitchen still warm, its fire still going, its walls holding the smell of food she had cooked freely, for people she had chosen to feed, at a table where she had sat at the head. She put her hand on the porch railing. The wood was cold and solid. The porch needs rebuilding, she said. I know, he said. I can see that. I'm thinking in the spring, she said, when the ground's right for it. Good thinking, he said. They stood on the imperfect porch of the house that was hers and watched the Wyoming afternoon light do what Wyoming afternoon light did, spread itself low and gold across the flat ground until everything it touched looked like it had been there forever and would stay. She was not at peace. She was not healed. She had 15 years of something heavy to put down slowly, the way you put down heavy things, not all at once, gradually, muscle by muscle, until your hands were finally empty. But she was standing on her own ground. For the first time in a long time, that was enough. The foundation man came the following Monday as promised, which was not nothing in Wyoming in November, when the cold could make a man rethink every outdoor commitment he'd made in a warmer moment. His name was Carl Briggs, and he was short and precise and spoke very little, but when he did speak, it was accurate, which Martha appreciated more than talkativeness. He spent 2 days shoring up the northwest corner with a methodical thoroughness that she watched when she could and trusted when she couldn't. When he finished, he showed her what he'd done and why and what to watch for going forward, walking her through it like she was capable of understanding it, which she was, and which not everyone assumed. She paid him the second half. He tipped his hat and left. She stood at the northwest corner of her house and pressed her palm flat against the foundation stone and felt nothing give. December came in hard and fast the way Wyoming winters did. Not gradually, not politely, just arriving one morning at full force as if it had been waiting outside the county line and finally lost patience. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night, and the ground froze solid and the wind off the plains found every gap in every wall and made itself known. Martha had expected this. She'd been stuffing gaps and reinforcing the weather stripping on the doors and windows for 3 weeks in preparation. The farmhouse was not warm the way a well-maintained house was warm. It was warm the way a house was warm when someone who understood it had worked hard to make it so. Imperfectly, with effort visible in the result, but genuinely and sufficiently warm. The kitchen fireplace ran most of the day. She'd learned quickly that the bread oven beside it threw heat differently than the main fire, and she could regulate the kitchen temperature with some precision by managing both. She cooked every day. Not for obligation, not for anyone's schedule, but her own. Not with anyone standing in a doorway telling her what was wrong with last year's version. She cooked because it was what she knew and what she loved, and because in her own kitchen at her own fire, it turned out to feel entirely different than it had felt for the past 15 years. The same hands, the same skills, a completely different experience of using them. She started writing things down in a journal she bought at the dry goods store in town. Not recipes exactly, but notes, ratios, observations, what worked at what temperature, what the bread oven did differently than the main fire, what happened to the venison brine when she let it go an extra 12 hours. She'd been carrying this knowledge in her head for years, and putting it on paper made her realize how much of it there was. Pages and pages. Margins full of small notes in her own handwriting, which was rounder and less disciplined than Silas's, but got the job done. She did not think about the restaurant at first. That came later, in the particular way that ideas came when you weren't looking at them directly. Sideways, peripheral, growing in the background of other thoughts, until one day you turned and found it fully formed. What happened first was the neighbors. There were 3 families within reasonable riding distance of the farmhouse, people she'd known peripherally for years as Calloway Ranch adjacencies, rather than her own neighbors. The nearest was the Weber family, a couple in their 50s with a grown son who worked the land with them, and a grandmother who had moved in 2 years prior after a fall had made living alone impractical. The grandmother's name was Ida, and she was sharp as a tack and had opinions about everything, including and especially food. Ada Weber showed up at Martha's door on a Thursday in mid-December with a jar of preserved plums and a forthright expression and said, "I heard the Calloway girl moved into the old Nora place. I wanted to see if you were surviving the winter." Martha let her in, made coffee. Ida sat at the kitchen table and looked around with the assessing eye of an older woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between a kitchen someone cooked in and a kitchen someone maintained. She looked at the journal open on the counter, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the cast iron skillet seasoned to a dark mirror shine. "You cook," Ida said. "I do," Martha said. "What's in that pot?" "Bean soup. Started it this morning." Ida looked at the pot on the fire. "With what?" Martha told her. Ida asked 3 more questions, each one more specific than the last, the questions of someone who actually knew what they were asking about. By the time the coffee was done, they were talking like people who had been talking for years, which was the way it went sometimes. You met someone and found the frequency immediately, like tuning to a clear signal after a lot of static. Ida came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. She started bringing her daughter-in-law, a quiet woman named Frances, who was a decent enough cook but freely admitted she'd never mastered pastry. Martha showed her the butter temperature trick, the reason cold mattered, the way you could feel in the dough when it had been worked exactly enough and not a stroke more. Frances came back the next week with a question about bread. By January, there were sometimes 4 women in Martha's kitchen on Thursday afternoons. She didn't plan it. It grew like the other things in her life had grown, not from a clean decision, but from a series of small movements in the same direction until the direction revealed itself. Silas noticed. He came by Thursday mornings, usually, before the afternoon gathered. He'd taken to helping her with the porch, which they were rebuilding board by board through the winter at whatever pace the weather permitted, which was slower than either of them would have chosen. But cold wood and cold hands and cold tools had their own timeline, and you worked within it or you didn't work. He was good with his hands in the unhurried way of someone who'd built things and fixed things and learned that precision mattered more than speed. "There were 5 horses tied to your fence post when I rode past Thursday," he said one morning in late January, on his knees replacing a porch board while she held the adjacent one in place. "The Weber women," she said, "and the Hollis girl from the South Quarter. She's been coming 3 weeks. He tapped the nail twice to set it, then drove it flush. "Cooking class?" "I wouldn't call it that." She thought about it. "More like, I show them something and then we eat it." He looked up at her. "Do they pay?" She blinked. The question had not occurred to her, which was itself a piece of information worth examining. "No," she said. He went back to the board. "Might consider it," he said, simply, no pressure behind it. She thought about it for the rest of the week. The following Thursday, she mentioned very quietly, without making it a formal thing, that she was going to start asking a small amount for the ingredients. She expected resistance. What she got was Ida Weber saying, "About time," without looking up from the dough she was working, and Frances nodding and looking relieved, as though she'd been waiting for permission to pay for something she was receiving. What she got, at the end of that Thursday afternoon, was $7.50 in small coins and folded bills left on the corner of her kitchen table. She stood and looked at it for a long moment after everyone had gone. $7.50 for an afternoon of doing exactly what she would have done anyway. She picked up the money and put it in the coffee tin on the third shelf where she kept her savings. And she stood in her kitchen in the quiet after everyone had left, the smell of bread and coffee and warm pastry still in the air, 5 coffee cups in the basin, the table with its flour-dusted surface. And she thought, for the first time clearly and directly, about what this could be. She thought about the dining room. The farmhouse had one, a room off the kitchen that her grandmother had used for storing things that didn't have another home, which over 15 years of disuse had accumulated into a layered accumulation of old furniture and equipment and things that needed to go. She'd been ignoring it because it wasn't critical for survival. She stood in the doorway of that room now and looked at it differently. She started clearing it the following Monday. It took 3 days. She moved what was worth keeping to the barn and hauled the rest outside. What was left was a room 12 feet by 14 feet with good wide plank flooring that cleaned up decent, a window on the south wall that let in winter light, and enough space for 3 tables if she was thoughtful about placement. She wrote down numbers, what tables would cost, what chairs, what it would take to expand the kitchen equipment to handle more volume consistently. She had the savings tin. She had the 40 acres, most of which she was now receiving grazing rental income from. The financial records Robert had produced had confirmed a neighboring rancher had been paying a seasonal rate for years, money that had been quietly absorbed into the main house accounts. That income, redirected to her, was not a large amount, but it was regular and it was hers. She went to see the bank in town in February, not to ask for anything yet, just to understand what was possible. The banker was a man named Elliot Crane, who had been behind that desk for 30 years and had the settled confidence of a man who had never in his life had to wonder who owned the chair he was sitting in. He looked at her across the desk with the particular patience of a man prepared to explain things to someone he assumed didn't fully understand them. She had brought the numbers she'd written down. She had brought the deed, certified copy, with Agnes Perrin's stamp on it. She had brought 2 months of records of what the Thursday afternoons had generated, which was more than she'd expected when she'd actually written it down. She put the numbers on his desk. He looked at them. His expression changed slightly, the way expressions changed when something came in under different expectations and recalibrated them. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He looked at the deed. "This property is fully yours?" he said. "It is," she said. He looked at the numbers again. "What are you calling it?" he asked. She hadn't had an answer to that question until that exact moment. It arrived, though, clean and immediate, the way right answers sometimes did. "The Prairie Table," she said. He wrote it at the top of her file. The loan wasn't large. She didn't need large. She needed enough for the dining room furniture and 2 more cast iron pieces and a sign that could be read from the road. The sign she had Silas help her with. Not make, she was clear about that. She wanted to make it herself, but she needed help with the mounting because the post needed to be deep enough to handle the wind. He held it while she set the post. They tested it against a deliberate push from both of them, and it held. They stood back and looked at it. "The Prairie Table, Emps Calloway, proprietor." Silas read it without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "Looks right." She agreed. She opened on a Tuesday in March, which was not the most strategic timing. Early spring in Wyoming was still cold and the roads were uncertain from thaw, but she had been ready since February, and waiting had started to feel like a form of old habit she was trying to break. She put up a notice in the dry goods store and the post office, and she told Ida Weber, which was the most efficient distribution method available. 3 people came this first day. The Webers, predictably, and a traveling man who'd seen the sign from the road and came in with the cautious expression of someone not sure what he was walking into. She fed him a bowl of bean soup and 2 biscuits and a slice of dried apple cake, and he ate it all without speaking and then said quietly, "How much?" And when she told him he paid it and left, and she didn't think much of it. He came back 3 days later with 2 other men, both of whom had the look of people who'd been recommended something by someone they trusted. By April, she was serving lunch 6 days a week. By May, she had hired the Hollis girl, whose name was June, and who was 17 and quick and needed the work, and learned fast enough that Martha had to stay deliberate about what she wanted to teach rather than what June could absorb. She was not making a fortune. She was making enough, which was a different thing, and in some ways a more satisfying one. Enough meant the loan payments were met and there was money left and the savings tin was getting heavier and the farmhouse was slowly, incrementally becoming more itself as she could afford to address each thing in the order it needed addressing. The soft board in the hallway got replaced in April. The east bedroom got a proper window in May. The porch, finished in late March, was solid and level, and she sometimes sat on it in the evenings with a cup of coffee just because she could. Edith came in on a Thursday in June. Martha saw her through the dining room window before she came in, recognized the mare, recognized the posture. She didn't react outwardly. She'd known this would happen eventually. She just wasn't sure what it would be when it did. Edith tied her horse and came up the new porch steps and through the door that June held for her with the professional neutrality that Martha had taught her for all customers, regardless of what you thought of them. The dining room had 4 tables now, 3 occupied with the lunch crowd. 2 ranching families and a pair of older women who drove from 2 towns over every other Thursday, which still amazed Martha every time they appeared. Edith looked at the room the way she looked at everything, with that total inventory gaze. She looked at the sign above the kitchen pass-through that Martha had painted herself, the prairie table in black on whitewash, and at the tables with their plain cloths and simple settings, and at the kitchen visible through the pass-through where Martha was working. Their eyes met through the opening. Martha nodded once. Edith nodded back. She sat at the small table near the window, the one Martha privately thought of as the best table, the one where the morning light came in clean and even. June took her order without being told to and came back to the kitchen and said simply, "Coffee and whatever you recommend," which were Edith's words and were, Martha recognized, a specific choice, relinquishing the usual control of specifying exactly what she wanted. Martha made the coffee. She put together a plate, biscuits, because they were what she was known for now, what people rode miles for, and a bowl of the beef stew she had on for lunch and a piece of the currant pie, which was rhubarb because the rhubarb had come in early this year and was exceptional. She carried it out herself. She set it in front of Edith and straightened up. Edith looked at the plate, then at Martha. "Sit down a moment," she said. It wasn't an order. It was close to a request. Martha looked at the kitchen. June could manage for 5 minutes. She pulled out the chair across from Edith and sat. They looked at each other across the table. 2 women with 15 years of complicated history and no clean language for most of it. "The place looks good," Edith said. "Thank you," Martha said. Edith wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Her hands, Martha noticed, looked older than they used to. Or maybe she was just looking at them differently. "Robert and I are thinking of reducing the herd this fall," Edith said. "Getting older. Harold's not—" She stopped. "Harold has his own ideas about what he wants to do with his life, which don't entirely involve the ranch." Martha said nothing. She waited. "I wanted you to know," Edith said, "in case it affects the grazing lease on your acres." "I appreciate that," Martha said. Edith looked at her coffee. "I used to tell myself," she said slowly, choosing each word with visible care, "that you weren't capable of managing land, managing money, making decisions." She paused. "I told myself that so many times that I stopped examining whether it was true." She looked up. "I think I knew, at some point, that I was keeping you small so you'd stay, but I dressed it up in something that sounded like concern." Her voice was even, but there was an effort in the evenness. "That's not an excuse. I know it isn't." Martha looked at her aunt. This was more than she'd gotten at the gathering, more careful, more stripped of the architecture. She thought about what it took to say it, not the words themselves, but what it cost to say them sitting across from the person you'd wronged, without the protection of a larger group around you, without the slight insulation of public admission. "I know," Martha said. "I'm sorry," Edith said. And this time it was not small and careful. It was just true. Martha sat with it. She wasn't going to say it was fine because it wasn't fine. She wasn't going to say she understood because understanding and forgiving weren't the same thing, and she wasn't interested in conflating them. What she could say honestly was what she said. I know you are. Edith nodded. She picked up a biscuit and took a bite, and her eyes did something Martha had never seen them do at a meal before. They closed for just a second, involuntarily, the way eyes closed when something was better than expected. Your grandmother would be... she started. Don't, Martha said gently, not harshly, just firmly. Edith stopped, nodded. Fair enough. She ate the rest of the meal in a quiet that was not comfortable but was honest, which Martha had come to think was more valuable than comfortable. She paid at the counter, which June handled. She put on her coat and her hat, and she paused at the door. The biscuits, she said without turning around. They were always the finest I'd eaten. She went out. Martha stood at the kitchen pass-through and watched through the window as her aunt mounted her horse and rode back south toward the main house, getting smaller with distance, and she felt, not warmth, not forgiveness in the full sense, not the clean resolution that stories usually promised, but something more honest than that. A door that had been held shut by tension for 15 years had been opened just enough for air to move through. That wasn't everything. It was something. June appeared at her elbow. You okay? Yes, Martha said. Who was that? My aunt, Martha said. She turned back to the stove. What's the order for table 2? Silas came for dinner that evening, as he'd started doing most Thursdays, not by arrangement exactly, more by the natural accumulation of habit between two people who found each other easy to be around. He came through the kitchen door the way he always did, the way that said he knew the difference between the front door and this one, between being a customer and being something else. He sat on the stool near the bread oven, which had become his stool, and drank coffee while she finished the clearing and cleaning that ended every dinner service. June had gone home an hour ago. The dining room was put back to rights. The kitchen was winding down. Your aunt came by, he said. It wasn't a question. June had apparently seen him in town. She did, Martha said. How was it? She thought about it, her hands in the wash water, working through the last of the pots. Hard, she said. And okay, at the same time. Yeah, he said. That's usually how those things are. She dried her hands. She poured herself a cup of coffee and came and sat, not on the stool beside his, but at the table behind her, and he turned on his stool so they were facing each other. The kitchen was warm and dim, and smelled the way it smelled at the end of every good day of cooking, layered, used, honest. I've been thinking, she said. I know, he said. You get a particular look. She looked at him. What look? Like you're working math in your head, but the math is about something else entirely. She huffed, which was approximately a laugh. The dining room, she said. I want to add a 4th table, and I want to look at what it would take to do dinner service twice a week. June's hours? He asked. I'd need another person, maybe part-time at first. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I talked to Frances Weber. She said she'd be interested. He nodded slowly. That's a good choice. She's reliable. She's also good now, Martha said. She's been practicing. Came to me 2 weeks ago with a pie crust she'd made on her own, and it was right. It was genuinely right. Silas smiled. It was a quiet smile, the kind that didn't announce itself, just appeared. You're proud of that, he said. I am, she said, and didn't feel the need to minimize it. They were quiet for a moment, with the fire settling and the wind outside and the particular quality of evening silence in a kitchen after the work is done. Not empty silence, but full silence. The silence of a space that has been used for good things and is resting. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask, she said. Last October, he said, when I rode up, you were sitting outside on that crate and I stayed because something about it seemed wrong and I didn't want to walk away from it. He looked at his coffee. I've been thinking about that, about whether it was the right thing. He stopped, started differently. I don't want to be someone who inserted himself into your story without being asked, and I've wondered if I was. She looked at him for a long moment. You brought me a document that proved I owned my own house, she said. Yes, he said, And you sat on a wooden crate in 35-degree wind and ate venison stew and didn't make it weird. I was hungry, he said, straight-faced. Silas. Martha. She set her cup down. You didn't insert yourself, she said. You were there. And you stayed and you didn't pretend something was normal when it wasn't. That's different. She thought about it more carefully because this was something she wanted to say right. My whole life, I had people around me all the time, family, people who'd known me since I was a child, and I was the loneliest I've ever been. You sat on a crate for an hour, and I felt less alone than I had in years. That's not about inserting yourself. That's about being the kind of person who actually shows up. She paused. Those are different things. He was looking at her with an expression she'd learned to read over the past months. Attentive, and behind the attentiveness something careful and wanting that he kept under control because that was how he was, but that she could see. I'm going to say something, he said. All right, she said. I'd like to court you properly, he said, if that's something you'd be open to. He said it plainly, without decoration, which was the only way she could have heard it and taken it seriously. I'm not going anywhere. I've got the land and I'm building something on it, and I intend to be here. And you're... He stopped. Tried again. You're someone I'd like to know better. More formally, if you want that. She looked at him. She thought about last October. The crate, the cold, the venison she'd made herself that she'd eaten outside in the wind. She thought about the document folded in her pocket against her chest, about the land office, about Carl Briggs and the foundation, about Thursday afternoons and the sound of women learning something in her kitchen and the savings tin getting heavier. About June asking you okay? At the kitchen pass-through with the easy directness of someone who assumed the answer mattered. About the sign out front that said her name on it. About what it meant to be asked what you wanted by someone who would actually wait for the answer. Yes, she said. I'd like that. He nodded. He looked down at his coffee, and at the corner of his mouth, quietly, was the smile again. She picked up her cup. Outside, the Wyoming night was full dark and cold and enormous, the way it was every night out here. The sky so wide and so full of stars that it was almost arrogant, the way extraordinary things were sometimes almost arrogant simply by existing. She had spent a long time believing that ordinary life, a table, a kitchen, a place where she belonged, was something other people had. Something she existed around the edges of. She had fed people and served people and made beautiful things with her hands and gone home to eat alone on a wooden crate because somewhere along the way she had accepted, without examining it, that this was what she was for. She understood now that accepting something for a long time didn't make it true. It just made it old. The Prairie Table had 12 regular customers who told other people. It had June Hollis learning pastry in the afternoons and Frances Weber starting dinner service on Fridays. It had a sign with her name on it that you could read from the road. It had a porch she'd helped build board by board over a Wyoming winter, imperfect and solid. It had a kitchen with a bread oven and a fireplace and shelves at the right height, and a stool near the bread oven where a man sat most Thursday evenings drinking coffee. It had a table at the head of which she sat. Not because someone gave it to her, not because someone decided she'd earned it or was ready for it or no longer needed to eat outside in the cold. Because she had claimed what was already hers, and then she had built everything else herself, with her own hands, one imperfect piece at a time. She wasn't the same woman who had sat on that crate in October. She wasn't entirely sure yet who this new version was. She was still meeting her, still discovering what she was capable of, still sometimes surprised by her own steadiness in moments that would have made the old Martha go quiet and fold. She suspected she'd be discovering it for years. That was fine. She had time. She had ground. She had a kitchen that smelled like everything a home was supposed to smell like. She finished her coffee. She would be up early tomorrow. She was always up early. And there was bread to start, and the rhubarb situation to address, and a fourth table to measure for, and a conversation to have with Frances about Friday evenings. There was always something next. She had learned to find comfort in that rather than fatigue. She rinsed her cup and set it in the basin and looked around her kitchen, which was the right size and the right shape and smelled right and was hers. Same time Thursday? Silas asked from the stool. Meaning he'd come by. Meaning if she wanted. Same time Thursday, she said. She turned off the kitchen lamp. Outside, the stars were doing their extravagant Wyoming thing, and the sign out front caught a little of the moonlight and held it, and the prairie table sat quiet and full and itself on the 40 acres that had always, from the beginning, belonged to Martha Calloway. She had just needed someone to make sure she knew.